Let me reassure any of you who are wondering, the store will be open after the reading, and Sir Martin will be lingering to sign any books that you wish to buy, so not to worry. We've been doing this for quite some time, and we're just delighted to have Sir Martin back on this occasion for this book, which is a particularly appropriate one, Churchill and America. 110 years ago next month, Sir Winston Churchill arrived in the United States for the first time, in New York for the first time. In 1900, he returned and delivered a lecture at the Waldorf Astoria just a few steps down Park Avenue here. And the man who introduced the evening was Mark Twain. 20 years ago, next month, Sir Martin came to Chartwell Booksellers for the first time. And tonight, we are delighted to have the eminent, esteemed editor and author Michael Korda introduce the evening. The congruencies, I think, are apt and earned, and I'm very pleased to introduce Mr. Michael Korda.
Sir Martin and I share a number of things in common. We are both British. We were both evacuated to this country via Canada as children during the Second World War. We both attended the same language school when we did our national service, our military service, a place called Joint Services School for Linguists at Bodmin, Cornwall, and we both attended Magdalen College. We are, as it were, undiscovered twins, clearly following the same track. In addition, and perhaps more important, he is, like myself, but on a vastly larger scale, an almost uncritical and fervent admirer of Winston Churchill. Let me say that at some point during the Second World War, Churchill was sent with Averell Harriman to Moscow to apologize to Stalin for the fact that there would not be an invasion, a second front in France in 1942 or 1943. And as you may imagine, Stalin had a fit of temper, rage and fury, which may well be justified in view of the enormous Russian casualties and the fact that we were not fighting the same kind of war at all as the Russians. And Churchill and Harriman sat transfixed by the rage that Stalin poured at both of them, and they were both men who were used to that kind of thing. And when it was all over, Stalin fell silent, apologized, and turned rather grumpily to Churchill and said, well, after all, history will be the judge of this. And Churchill thought for a moment and said, yes, yes, indeed, but mark you, I intend to be the one who writes the history. The man who writes his own history is fortunate. More fortunate still is the man who has a brilliant, dedicated, and enormously able and enormously enthusiastic biographer and historian. And in that sense, almost as much as in his own books, Winston Churchill has been astonishingly well served by Sir Martin Gilbert, whose works on Churchill are indispensable and enormous. Behind my desk in the country sits an enormous, huge book cabinet stuffed with books, most of them written by Martin Gilbert. And I turn to them both because, since he is a historian's historian, always accurate in his facts, he is the one place where I can check up on anything about the Second World War, and also because it is an inspiration to turn behind me and see the industry with which Martin has approached this enormous historical task and his enormous success at it. Every time I think I cannot write another word about Grant or about Ike or about any of these things, I pause and I look behind me and I say, well, if Martin Gilbert could write all those books, surely I can write just one.
Is there any way of having the lights up so I can see that there are some faces in front of me? I'm looking into a dark void, and I like to see some expression. Brilliant. Oh, yeah. Okay, that's all I can get, and I can see some human beings in the back of the hall. Hey, thank you, Michael, for your very kind words. As you say, we had a bizarre parallel track of evacuation, and then Magdalen College, and then the Joint Service School for Linguists. And like Michael, I still wake up and dream with the Russian phrases which were thrust at us in those days. Shida kasha, pisha nasha, shida kasha, pisha nasha. And you had to learn everything by rote until it came out of every pore. I'd long wanted to write about Churchill and America, partly because he was all his life an opponent of the undercurrent, pullulating undercurrent of anti-Americanism in British society. He couldn't stand it. And partly because he was the Briton who most understood the extent of Britain's dependence upon the United States in 2 world wars, and how much it owed to America for its survival and for its victory. English people found it odd that he was half American. In the 1900s, his Tory critics, as he became the scourge of the Tory party, with which he'd begun his life, called him half alien and wholly reprehensible. But sometimes his Americanness was seen as an advantage. I found a very interesting letter by one of his First World War civil servants at the Ministry of Munitions, when the civil servants were debating the problems of having Churchill as their minister. Every ministry he went to always caused a sort of tremor of concern as to what they were getting as their chief. And he wrote to a colleague, "There's a lot of Yankee in Winston, I agree, but he knows how to hustle and to make others hustle too." And this was an American characteristic with which he was blessed. And one of his secretaries, who came with him here in 1930-31, wrote to her mother, "Unlike most Englishmen, he is naturally at ease among Americans, who seem to understand him better than his own countrymen." And that also intrigued me, and I believe it to be true, that on many of the central events of Churchill's life and his thoughts, Americans did understand him better than so many of his own countrymen. What I'd like to reflect on this evening is what the United States meant to Churchill. First and foremost, it was his mother's land, and he was very conscious of that all his life. Not only his mother's land, but he became fascinated by his American grandfather, by his mother's father, Leonard Jerome, and he shared many of Jerome's characteristics, and at one point contemplated writing a biography of Jerome and assembled quite a lot of material. And I use in the book some of the notes which he wrote about his grandfather, whom he knew and whom he saw when he came to England, as he often did, and indeed Leonard Jerome died in England. He was a man of mighty characteristics. He was an entrepreneur. He was known as the King of Wall Street during the period of his first and even second fortunes, both of which he lost but subsequently recovered. He was the founder of the American turf, And he was a tremendous patriot. He used a considerable part of his fortune in the Union cause, to help the Union cause, including paying for one of the Union warships, the Meteor. Equally thrilling to Churchill was that 3 of his American ancestors had fought in the war against Britain, in the American War of Independence. And he liked that idea. He was never a comfortable, characteristic British aristocrat, and everybody else was foreigners. He was also proud that George Washington appears in his family tree as a collateral member of the tribe. And when he made his famous remark to Congress at his first address of a joint session in January 1942, he meant it. I like to feel that had my mother been English and my father American and not the other way round, I would have got here on my own. And indeed, as you'll see in the book, he did have a cousin who did extremely well in American politics and might well have emerged as a presidential candidate, and who knows, paralleled him in his career. I found another lovely example of his pride in his American ancestry, which was reported to me by one of the Americans of whom he was particularly fond and whose company he greatly enjoyed. Some of you may have known her, Kay Halley, the girl whom Randolph Churchill so desperately wanted to marry and to whom Randolph proposed in 1930. And Kay Halley recorded in her fascinating notes, I don't know if they've ever been published, I don't think so, of her many meetings and conversations with Churchill. She recorded an incident that had taken place during a discussion in Eisenhower's presidency about whether there should be a single rifle for the British and American forces, a standard rifle. And essentially both armies felt they should stick to their own rifle, and for various reasons. And then Field Marshal Slim, the leading British representative at these negotiations, said, well, I suppose we could experiment with a bastard rifle, part English, part American. And Churchill said, kindly moderate your language, Field Marshal. Remember that I am partly English, partly American. Another thing which intrigued Churchill was that almost certainly American Indian blood flowed in his veins. He was 1/64th Native American. I don't know whether that would have entitled him to run a casino or something in the modern age. But all through his life, when he was confiding, say, in a doctor or a friend, he would always, to justify some characteristic, some scalping characteristic, he'd say, well, you do know that I am partly American Indian. Another thing which the United States meant to Churchill, and I've tried to trace this in the book, it's an interesting aspect. From his earliest days, he had made a close study of the American Civil War. And he was on his visits here in 1929 and 1931 to make extensive visits to the Civil War battlefields, many of them in the company of Richard Freeman, the great historian of the Civil War. When he was a 5-year-old living in Viceregal Lodge in Dublin, Ulysses S. Grant came and was entertained by Churchill's grandfather, the Duke of Marlborough, and by his parents, though, alas, we have no record on either side of whether the young lad peeped over the balustrade to look at the distinguished general and president. But we do know that the next year, as a 6-year-old schoolboy, he chanced, as you can in any British public school or boarding school library, upon those wonderful, heavily bound back numbers of Punch magazine with their superb cartoons and political commentaries. And he was going through the back numbers of Punch at his first boarding school, the terrible one where he was so savagely beaten by the headmaster, as were many other boys, that blood was drawn and his parents took him away. Christopher Fry was at the same school and describes this headmaster's sadism. And he took refuge in the back numbers of Punch. And here is his lovely description, looking back some 40 years later. First of all, he writes, Mr. Punch was against the South, and we had a picture of a fierce young woman, Miss Carolina, about to whip a naked slave, with a kind of scourge which, not being myself removed out of the zone of such possibilities, I regarded as undoubtedly severe. I was all for the slave. And then he remembered another cartoon of the North and the South, as he writes, as two savage, haggard men in shirts and breeches, grappling and stabbing each other with knives as they reeled into an abyss marked bankruptcy. And finally, he remembered in the Punch a drawing of Lincoln's tomb, and as he recalled it, Britannia, very sad, laying a wreath upon the cold marble. When his parents asked him what book he would like for his 13th birthday, he replied, Grant's Illustrated History of the American Civil War. And it's interesting to note that Churchill, who was an incredibly avaricious reader and read novels and plays as well as political memoirs and political books, and tried often to acquire them from the publishers in their final proof form before they were actually published. It's interesting to note that in 1896, when he was 21 years old, he wrote to a number of his American friends urging them to read Stephen Crane's Red Badge of Courage and describing to them what a remarkable book it was. As Barry Singer said, he came here first in 1900, and he was quite amazed by New York, which was the one city he visited at that time. He was on his way to Cuba to watch the Spaniards grappling with the Cuban insurrection at that time. And he wrote to his young brother, picture to yourself the American people as a great lusty youth who treads on all your sensibilities, perpetrates every possible horror of ill manners, whom neither age nor just tradition inspire with reverence, but who moves about his affairs with a good-hearted freshness which may well be the envy of older nations of the earth. He only had one problem here in New York. He went over Brooklyn Bridge to visit his mother's birthplace in Henry Street, Brooklyn, which still has a plaque on it. And in order to cross Brooklyn Bridge in those days, you had to pay, and the fare was $1. And the dollar was, I don't think I've got one here, funny sort of piece of paper. And he'd never seen that. He paid, Englishmen paid in gold sovereigns, half sovereigns, silver sixpences, silver threepenny bits. Paper money was something he just was astonished. And he wrote to his American aunt, I paid my fare across Brooklyn Bridge with a paper dollar. I should think the most disreputable coin the world has ever seen. I wondered how to reconcile the magnificent system of communication with the abominable currency. I think I have found the answer. The communication of New York is due to private enterprise, while the state is responsible for the currency. Hence, I come to the conclusion that the very first-class men of America are in the counting houses and the less brilliant ones in the government. The United States was also for Churchill a very important source of income. His first lecture tour in 1901 brought him in an astonishing sum of money, though he was disappointed with his agent for taking too high a percentage. And he lectured all over the east of the country, and he very bravely spoke about the Boer War, in which he had just fought, to American audiences whose sympathies were with the Boers against the overwhelming power of the British Empire. And he charmed and won his audiences by speaking with great respect for the Boer soldier, the Boer adversary. Indeed, he gave slide lectures, and he would put up a picture of a Boer soldier, and he would say, "I honor his courage." When he said the same thing in the House of Commons on his return from the United States, in his maiden speech, the House of Commons was aghast. His own party, the Conservatives, felt that he was losing them votes and that this was anti-patriotic. So here was an interesting contrast between the American openness and the British closeness. Now, when he returned from his first visit in 1900, in 1895, some of you may have forgotten that Britain and the United States were then on the verge of war. We found an incredible casus belli, and that was the boundary between Venezuela, which you were supporting, and British Guiana, which we were, of course, supporting. And Churchill was pretty convinced that when his ship brought him back to Liverpool, he would have virtually to change ships and return in a troop ship to Canada to be part of the British garrison which would be challenging the United States. And so in his first speech in the House of Commons, this same maiden speech where he had praised the Boer fighters and been so abused for it, he made an incredible statement. I've often wondered when I work about Churchill how, when I write about him and read his work, how his mind formulated and articulated these statements, because he was a young man, we're talking now somebody of 25, and he told the House of Commons, essentially his elders and betters, who were discussing building up the British Army so that it could challenge the United States if necessary, should there be another Venezuela boundary dispute type of clash. He told them, evil would be the counselors, dark would be the day when we embarked on that most foolish, futile, and fatal of all wars, a war with the United States. And ironically, the only treaty I've ever been able to find, despite Churchill's desperate search all his life for an Anglo-American alliance, we never had one, but the only treaty I found which he signed with Franklin Roosevelt, they both initialed it, was a secret agreement signed in 1942 whereby both countries pledged not to use the atom bomb against the other. So somehow evil counselors and dark days were to be avoided. When the First World War came, Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty in charge of the British Navy and in charge of the aerial defense of Britain. And he immediately entered into secret and productive relations with the great American steel baron, Charles Schwab of Bethlehem Steel. And the two men made a series of agreements which effectively breached America's neutrality legislation and were to form the basis of the breach of American neutrality which General Marshall was to connive with Winston Churchill in 1940. And essentially what Schwab did was manufacture the submarines which Britain could not manufacture. We didn't have the resources to manufacture sufficient submarines. We desperately needed them for the naval war. And to manufacture them as steel parts with the rivets and nuts and bolts in separate boxes and put them on trains to Montreal in Canada. and it was not illegal to export lumps of metal with holes in or to export rivets. And there in Montreal they were assembled. They became known as the Montreal boats and played an important part in our war effort. And Churchill also persuaded Schwab, who was keen to help. He came over to Britain on the Olympic, and in fact was immediately interned because, together with all the other passengers on the Olympic, which was an ocean liner, they witnessed the sinking of the British battleship Audacious. And news of the sinking of the Audacious had to be kept secret, as throughout that war and the Second World War, these naval disasters had to be kept from the public to avoid a drop in morale. And so everybody who'd seen it, all these American travelers, were interned and held incommunicado, but Schwab persuaded his jailers somehow to release him and let him go and see the First Lord in London. And although the United States couldn't export finished war materials to a belligerent, Churchill discovered that Schwab had already manufactured, but still had in Allentown, the massive naval guns, these extraordinary 15-inch guns, two of which you can see at the entrance to the Imperial War Museum in London, for other countries, including Greece. And so he persuaded Schwab to sell them to him, and of course they were no longer American guns. They already belonged to the Greeks, who were promised compensation, and so he acquired these guns as well. One of the themes of Churchill's relationship with America, which I've tried to show in the book, and it's a very deep and dark theme in a way. All his life, all his working life, his political life, he found cause for deep disagreement and bitterness and disappointment and anger with the United States, which he felt should never see the light of day. He was convinced that his anger and bitterness and disappointment were correct, but he so believed in the essential nature of the Anglo-American relationship, what we now call the special relationship, that he kept these criticisms as private as possible. You can only find them in his personal letters to his wife, or in little jottings and notes which he made, or in passages which he wrote in his memoirs, which he decided not to put in so as not to rock the boat of Anglo-American relations. And the first great bitterness came in May 1915, when the war in Western Europe had become a trench war, a terrible bloody slanging match and slaughter between Britons and Germans, culminating in the battles of Neuve-Chapelle and Loos in 1915. And Churchill, as he did with Roosevelt throughout 1940, begged the Americans to enter the war on the grounds, A, that it was their cause, as indeed eventually Woodrow Wilson and the Senate concluded, and the United States made the essential contribution to the First World War, enabled Germany to be defeated. But Churchill saying, if you come in now is the time when you can tilt the balance. And Wilson would not. And this is what Churchill wrote. Here's an example of a passage which he deleted from his war memoirs, but which expressed his feelings. And he's talking about what would have happened if the United States had entered the First World War in May 1915 instead of 2 years later. And he writes, "If done then, what abridgment of the slaughter, what sparing of the agony, what ruin, what catastrophes would have been prevented? In how many millions of homes would an empty chair be occupied today? How different would be the shattered world in which victors and vanquished alike are condemned to live." And this bitterness was offset in part by the Americans whom he met when he went in 1916 as a lieutenant colonel commanding a Scottish battalion in the trenches of the Western Front. And as you know, some 26,000 Americans, an enormous number, volunteered to fight with the British, French, or Belgian armies, and did so, and fudged their identities and fudged their birthdays. Many of them were too young, actually. And one of those whom Churchill met, he met a number, but one he met, Harvey Butters, became a close friend of his. In fact, when they both had leave, Churchill took him to the theatre in London, and Butters was killed on the Somme in August 1916. And Churchill was deeply saddened by his death. And in the obituary which he wrote of Butters, which was published in the Observer newspaper, the Sunday Observer, he wrote about Butters' character and so on, and he ended his obituary. He did not come all the way from San Francisco only out of affection for the ancient home of his forebears, or in a spirit of new adventure. He was in sentiment a thorough American, but he had even then a very clear and firm conception of the issues which are at stake in the struggle. And Churchill tried in his writings and in his speeches, as he was to do in 1940 and 41, to impress on such American readers as he could find, and he had a big readership over here all his life, that the cause for which Britain was fighting from 1914 was the American cause. And then the United States entered the war. And Churchill, almost simultaneously, was appointed Minister of Munitions. And he found himself working extremely closely with American officials at every level. And this working together played an enormous part in his understanding of how the United States could conduct war, and was to play a major part in the Second World War, and was to be one of the reasons why Gil Wynant, and Averell Harriman were so important to him in 1941, 42, and 43. He worked in 1917 and 1918 with Edward Stettinius, the father of the future Secretary of State, who was then the American raw materials czar in Europe, and with Admiral Sims, who was the senior American war resources supremo, and with Bernard Baruch, who was the head of the War Industries Board here in the United States. And for him it was not only an exhilarating time to work with these Americans, but he found that he could make his contribution to America's war effort. And the largest proportion of American tanks and aircraft which were in action in 1918, and by far the largest proportion of those which would have been in action in 1919, had Germany not suddenly collapsed, were manufactured by Churchill for the United States, principally at two great factories, a tank and aircraft factory in France, which he set up and managed for the Americans. And he wrote of his work as Minister of Munitions, and he was chairman of the Inter-Allied Munitions Council, essentially Britain, France, and the United States, also Serbia and Italy and Russia pulled out. We carried on the war in common in every sense of the expression. We transferred masses of every kind of material in every stage of production, from one ledger to the other, in accordance with our very different needs, as easily as two friends might share a luncheon basket. Churchill also found himself in 1917 and 18, as he was to be throughout the Second World War, the principal voice trying to explain to the British people why the arrival of the United States troops in action, was the essential way forward to victory. that there should not be jealousies and bitternesses. The Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force, Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, wrote in his diary, after he read of America's entry into the war, "Please God, give me victory before the Americans arrive." Churchill believed this was not only the most absurd, foolish sentiment, but that it was condemning, as it did condemn, tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers to their death in the futile offensive at Passchendaele, where there simply was not the number and momentum and superiority which he, Churchill, knew and insisted in Cabinet the Americans would bring with them within 6 months. And so it happened. He was recognized by the American leaders and was given his wonderful American medal, which you can see at Chartwell, his home in Kent, as really the British minister, the British cabinet minister, who had done the most to help the Americans forward. And so it was he who rode with General Pershing in the victory parade and took the salute of the Allied armies in Hyde Park. And then came the second and greatest disappointment for Churchill vis-à-vis the United States. Churchill had been excited by Woodrow Wilson's vision of a League of Nations that would be set up after the war and that would have a system of collective security whereby any nation that sought to make war on another would be confronted by the collective force of all the other nations. And he recognized correctly that that collective force of all the other nations would have to be led by the United States. And so Wilson's vision excited him as the way to reconcile the endless, mindless hatred of Teuton and Gaul, as he called them, of Germans and Frenchmen, and to bring peace to Europe after a series of bloody and divisive wars. And then the United States Senate turned down the whole concept, and the United States withdrew from Europe. And for the rest of his life, between the wars and during the Second World War and after the Second World War, Churchill was to look back at this moment, in public as well as private, as a terrible moment for Europe and for the world. In 1937, as the new war clouds were gathering, he wrote to one of his closest American friends, "How you must regret, how we all regret, that Wilson's dream was not carried through. For I have no doubt it would have made the difference between a safe, happy, prosperous world and the present hideous panorama." And then, in his extraordinary speech, which I mentioned, to the joint House, the House of Representatives and the Senate, at the beginning of 1942, which you can watch, it was filmed and it's fascinating to watch it, he begins with his remark about his American mother and his English father, and he goes on with rousing sentiments, and there's tremendous excitement on the floor, and you can hear the cheers and the excitement. And then he felt he had to say the following, and the whole Congress falls silent. And he said to them, "If we had kept ourselves together after the last war, if we had taken common measures for our safety, this renewal of the curse would never have fallen upon us. 5 or 6 years ago, it would have been easy, without shedding a drop of blood, for the United States and Great Britain, acting together, to have insisted on the fulfillment of the disarmament clauses of the treaties which Germany had signed after the war. That chance passed. It was gone forever. Prodigious hammer strokes will be needed to bring us together again. And when war came, he was one of those who ensured that those prodigious hammer strokes would take place. And I think one of the most remarkable aspects of his leadership in the Second World War was the way in which he worked up the United States from a position of distance and disinterest with terrible difficulty but enormous patience to provide the weapons which we desperately needed, to provide us with the munitions without which we would have been defeated surely at the end of 1940 or early 1941. He worked tremendously hard, and he created, after Pearl Harbor, a unity of command, which the Joint Chiefs of Staff was the apex of it, which he really guarded and nourished and understood to be the key to victory. And one of his greatest disappointments after the Second World War was that Clement Attlee, the Labour Prime Minister, and Ernest Bevin, the British Foreign Minister, refused to contemplate the continuation of the Joint Chiefs of Staff situation between Britain and the United States. They turned back again to this really very disingenuous anti-Americanism which sometimes pops up in our society. So close was the relationship between the British and American planners for victory after Pearl Harbor. And I write something in the book, for example, about the intelligence working together, which was intimate and decisive. So close was this relationship that when, during the long preparations for D-Day, for the Normandy landings, Churchill would sometimes say, "I'd like to see the officer in charge of this aspect or that aspect of the landings," he never knew until that officer came into his room in Downing Street whether it was going to be a British officer or an American officer. The systems were intimately woven together. I mentioned earlier that he had struggled to persuade Roosevelt to enter the war in 1940. Just as he had hoped and believed that the entry of the United States in May 1915 would have been decisive, so he felt that if the United States had been able to declare some form of belligerency at the time when the German armies were approaching Paris, that would have transformed the situation on the ground. And Roosevelt disingenuously telegraphed to Churchill indicating that he would do so. And then when Churchill said, "If you make this public, this will be so effective," and then Roosevelt pulled back and said he would not do it. And at that moment, Churchill felt he had lost not only the future for Europe, but that he had lost his relationship with the United States. He had worked so hard to try to establish some working relationship with Roosevelt. Unfortunately, they didn't meet until August 1941. Churchill had done everything possible to somehow wean Roosevelt, including in 1933 sending him a proposal for a joint currency, a joint dollar sterling currency, which we're still waiting for. We haven't joined the euro, but we haven't yet joined the dollar. But that was Churchill's vision. He understood, of course, that the British government, of which he was not a part, was keeping the United States at arm's length. And one of his deepest quarrels with Neville Chamberlain during the appeasement debate was that when Roosevelt offered to set up a conference for the European powers to discuss the problems of January 1938 before the Austrian Anschluss, it was Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, who said, no, we don't want the United States interfering. Of course, Chamberlain was then had this grandiose vision, if one can call it that, of an Anglo-German condominium and an Anglo-German unity that would be the future for Europe. And Churchill was deeply disappointed, and he understood that Roosevelt was, as he was indeed, displeased to feel that his initiative, coming after the long isolationist period, was so dismissed. One thing that the United States always meant to Winston Churchill was the undefeatable nation. Churchill made a calculation which other people made. He wasn't unique in making it. In 1909, that the United States was then already the most powerful nation in the world. Of course, Britain still had a greater fleet, but that its productive capacity, its raw material resources, that these made it the greatest country. And there were many pointers to this which he understood, including, for example, America's pioneering efforts in aviation. He even had a scenario which he wrote up in 1930, whereby the United States would have intervened before the First World War to set up a global institution which would, when war clouds loomed in Europe in 1914, effectively end the imminent conflict and bring about a United States of Europe. And when his friends and colleagues in the 30s, and then when war came in September 39, spoke disparagingly of the United States, he had no time for that. His experiences of the First World War, his tremendous confidence of the United States economic recovery after the great crash. He was here in New York on the day of the great crash, and the next day went to the floor of the stock exchange, and he wrote a fascinating account, which I quote, of that black moment in American financial history, and he instructed his stockbroker to start buying because he said, there is no way the United States can go down. The United States has this enormous power which will reassert itself. And then when Pearl Harbor came, many people in Britain, including in his cabinet, felt that this was the great disaster for Britain, that somehow the United States would be totally vulnerable or would not participate effectively in either war, either in the war in Europe, after Hitler declared war on you 4 days after Pearl Harbor, or in the war in Asia. And I'd like to read his very remarkable account of his feelings immediately after Pearl Harbor. And he was one of the very first people in the world to learn the full scale of Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt informed him almost immediately that Roosevelt learned of the actual scale of what it had been long before it became public knowledge here or anywhere. And he wrote, "No American will think it wrong of me if I proclaim that to have the United States at our side was to me the greatest joy. I could not foretell the course of events. I do not pretend to have measured accurately the martial might of Japan. But now, at this very moment, I knew the United States was in the war up to the neck and into the death. So we had won after all. Yes, after Dunkirk, after the fall of France, after the threat of invasion, when we were an almost unarmed people, after the deadly struggle of the U-boat war, after 17 months of lonely fighting and 19 months of my responsibility in dire stress, we had won the war. England would live. How long the war would last, or in what fashion it would end, no man could tell, nor did I at that moment care. Once again in our Long Island history, we should not be wiped out. Our history would not come to an end. We might not even have to die as individuals. And then he went on, silly people, and there were many, not only in enemy countries, might discount the force of the United States. Some said they were soft, others that they would never be united. They would fool around at a distance. They would never come to grips. They would never stand bloodletting. Their democracy and system of recurrent elections would paralyze their war effort. They would just be a vague blur on the horizon to both friend and foe. American blood flowed in my veins. I thought of a remark which Sir Edward Grey, the Foreign Secretary, had made to me more than 30 years before, that the United States was like a gigantic boiler. Once the fire is lighted under it, there is no limit to the power it can generate. Being saturated and satiated with emotion and sensation, I went to bed and slept the sleep of the saved and the thankful. And then followed these extraordinary years of Anglo-American cooperation, enormous differences, enormous disputes, but never a breach and never a moment's hesitation in Churchill's mind that the way forward was to work intimately and honestly with the United States. He believed that there was no disagreement that could not be resolved either by his personal contact with President Roosevelt or by his growing intimacy with many of those in Roosevelt's cabinet and Roosevelt's entourage, such as Wynant, the ambassador in Britain, and Harriman, and many others. Churchill had one more hope as the war was coming to an end, and I suppose it's a hope that has not been entirely shattered. He believed that once the victory was won, an Anglo-American unity, whether in the form of an alliance or not, some form of Anglo-American association should be the focal point of the preservation of the peace of post-war Europe. As he said on Thanksgiving Day 1944 to a great crowd of British and American soldiers, the future Thanksgiving Day will be when the union of action we have created in war, forged upon us by our common hatred of tyranny, will become a lasting union of sympathy and good feeling and loyalty and hope between our two peoples. And when the war ended, he felt buoyed up, rescued, in fact, by the way in which President Truman grasped the nettle of collective security, the very nettle that Woodrow Wilson had been not allowed to grasp, and when Clement Attlee and Ernest Bevin turned their backs precipitously and against all their treaties and pledges, turned their backs on the maintenance of democracy in Greece and Turkey, Truman within 10 days stepped in, and what we now know as the Truman Doctrine was created, that the United States, and in due course Britain, had a responsibility for maintaining the peace of the world, and at that point restraining the advance of communism. The other thing which gave Churchill tremendous hope was the Marshall Plan. People in Britain still really don't understand what the Marshall Plan was. It was not a handout. It was a commitment by the United States to support the economic revival of a Europe whose nations would work together. First of all, an economic recovery to get out of the terrible slough of despond, of post-war poverty and post-war privation, but more importantly, to build up common institutions and a common economic future. Indeed, it was the genesis and origin of the European Union. And Churchill wrote to Marshall to congratulate him, and to Churchill's amazement, Marshall replied and said, "But it was your speech in Zurich a year ago which gave me the idea." And indeed, in his Zurich speech, Churchill had said that Europe had to unite, it had to build up common economic institutions, and the United States would be the great guarantor and stimulator of that effort if the effort was to succeed. The United States as an essential ally was something which Churchill himself was able to forward in his second premiership between 1951 and 55. And one of the documents which I've never seen reproduced in any history book or collection of documents, perhaps Blair and Bush should think of issuing it as a pamphlet because we're coming up to its anniversary, was the Declaration of Principles which Churchill and Eisenhower signed in the White House, in which Britain and the United States, I quote, assert their sympathy for and loyalty to all those still in bondage, proclaim their desire to reduce armaments and to turn nuclear power into peaceful channels, confirm their support of the United Nations and all organizations designed to promote and preserve peace in the world, and proclaim their destination to develop and maintain the spiritual, economic, and military strength necessary to pursue their purposes effectively, based on their mutual comradeship. Churchill left office in April 1955, and as Michael Corder and others of you may remember, this rather dramatic moment in his long career, 55 years after he'd entered Parliament and after two great premierships, was not in the British press, because the British press was then on strike. There are no national newspapers telling us that Winston Churchill has finally laid down the baton of responsibility. Only a few funny little cyclo-styled news sheets, which one bought for a penny at street corners. And he summoned his cabinet together for a final chat, and they included two future prime ministers, Eden and Macmillan, and many who were to become leaders of the Conservative Party and of British national life. And he said to them, there are two things which matter, and two things I want you to bear in mind. One is, when you're embarking on your legislation, to remember that man is not only a material thing, that man is spirit. And the other thing is, never be separated from the Americans. Thank you.
So Martin has suggested that he would accept a few questions if you have any.
Well, this was a question as to why Churchill was turned out in 1945 from someone who was shocked at the time, following it as he did in junior high, right? And indeed, I followed it in junior school too. The answer is really very simple. In 1940, when Churchill became Prime Minister, he set up a coalition government. He was not even leader of the Conservative Party, and he brought into his coalition Conservatives, Socialists, Labour Party members, to whom he in fact gave the principal positions, and Liberals, members of the Liberal Party, and people of no political party who he felt were good. And this national government ruled from May 1940 until May 1945. Inasmuch as it had any political agenda, it followed Churchill's appointee, Sir William Beveridge, in the idea of having, after the war, a national non-party social policy. In other words, introducing as an all-party measure, perhaps even as a national government measure, social reforms which were desperately needed by then. In May 1945, Churchill consulted with the Labour leaders, with Clement Attlee, his deputy prime minister, and Ernest Bevin and Herbert Morrison, the other two stalwarts, and A.V. Alexander, and they agreed that they would continue the national government. Now, as they would remain in central positions, and he would remain prime minister, for at least a year after the defeat of Germany, and with an option to do so for a year after the defeat of Japan. At that time, of course, the defeat of Japan it had no known date to it. And that this national government would then pursue a national social policy. It happened by chance, by ill chance, that the Labour government, the Labour Party at that time, was holding its annual conference. And Attlee, Bevin, Morrison and Alexander went down to the annual conference, and there they rather blithely announced that, this is what they were doing. And the Labour Party was outraged. They had not been in power in any form since 1931. They were hungry to have their hands on the levers of power, not to share them with anyone else in whatever cause. And so they voted to leave the coalition, even though the war with Japan was still being fought. And Attlee returned from the conference and said to Churchill, "My party have voted to leave the coalition." And so at that moment, Churchill's government, the national government, the war-making coalition was over, and Britain returned to party politics, and an election had to be called. And Churchill remained Prime Minister at the head of what was called a caretaker government of Conservatives. Very unhappy at this, he tried to persuade them to at least put into their election program these measures of social reform, including a national health service, something you still don't have, a national health service as part of the Conservative program, because he supported it very strongly. But the British Medical Association, believe it or not, put great pressure on the Conservatives not to introduce a national health service. And so for 3 months, Churchill was head of this extraordinary rump Conservative government, waiting for the election to decide who would in fact rule. The Conservatives, in my view, although they didn't do particularly badly at the election in terms of numbers of the electorate, had no hope. Partly because Churchill had, in the 10 interwar years, been the most powerful and effective scourge of the Conservative Party, and had revealed to the British public its ineptness and its weakness and its pathetic behavior with regard to the defense of the realm. So here we are, still fighting a war against Japan, and being asked to vote for people who Winston Churchill, our Prime Minister, our wartime leader, has shown to have been incompetent when it came to the national defense in the 1930s. Anyway, he campaigned very bravely. Many Labour voters cheered him vociferously and believed, foolishly perhaps, that even if Labour got in, he would somehow still remain Prime Minister. When the votes were counted, and Churchill was then at Potsdam and returned for the election results, the Conservatives had lost. We had gone back to party politics, and the party Churchill had spent so long denouncing was defeated. Ironically, when his family tried to commiserate with him and say, how ungrateful the British people were, he said, not at all. They've had a very hard time, and they deserve something better than the Conservatives could have given them. Well, Churchill, I think, is very fortunate in the United States in that he is remembered as a war leader and as a great national figure, and there is a sort of fascination with him, which I approve, as a great man, as a man of great qualities. But you have to remember that in England, he was a figure in the political struggles which England went through from 1900 until 1955, and he was outspoken. He didn't suffer fools gladly. He didn't suffer idiocy and absurdity gladly. And he made enemies one way or another almost across the whole spectrum of British political life. When I began my researches, I worked for his son Randolph from 1962 to 1968, until Randolph's death, and I took over the enterprise. I would meet many distinguished conservatives and people, including those who had held high office in his administrations, who would take me aside after dinner or whatever, however we met, lunch in the House of Lords or whatever the venue was, and would say, of course, you have to realize, Gilbert, that Winston was fatally flawed, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, out it would come. What was the main one? That he had supported Home Rule for Ireland, that he had supported an independent Southern Irish Catholic state. And indeed, he had brought in the Irish Free State Bill in 1921, which established what is now the Republic of Ireland. And they hated him for it in 1965 as much as they had hated him for it 40 years earlier. And so there were all these sort of bills of indictment against him, which went back a long way. There were those who felt that as a result of Churchill's undoubted skills and energies, the tariff system, so beloved of conservatives, was lost, and Britain was committed to free trade. Now, the free trade tariff debate, it hasn't completely died. As you know, with your relations with Canada, things are not good on that score. But in Britain, this again was considered something that he had been the sort of pusher of. Another thing which was always held against him, and of course I've lived long enough now that I know that all these beliefs, they change. I mean, the things that in 1960 were considered horrendous signs of mistakes and absurdity on Churchill's part now might not be considered so absurd. And one of the most interesting ones is that many conservatives told me that when he was Home Secretary in 1910 in charge of the prison service, he had promiscuously reduced the prison population, reduced the severity of punishments, virtually brought an end to the very cruel system of solitary confinement, brought an end to what we now call political imprisonment, of people who are imprisoned, brought an end to imprisonment for non-payment of fines, and these things were considered to be just a sign of sentimentality and absurdity. And I remember I was still working with Randolph. It must have been in 1967, and the phone rang, and it was Robert Kennedy on the telephone, and he said, I believe that in 1910 Churchill set out a philosophy of criminal justice, and Kennedy was then working on some criminal justice bill or legislation, and he said, is there any way you could find it for me? And by a bizarre fluke, it was a complete fluke, I had it on my desk. I happened to have it on my desk, and I said, well, I'll read it to you. And in it, Churchill said that every criminal has a right against the state even after he has been convicted, and the state has an obligation to seek the rehabilitation in ordinary civil life of every criminal in prison. Well, at the time for the Tories, that was anathema. Indeed, today we have a toughening of our attitude towards these things. So he had built up a tremendous legacy of political enmity. Not so much his faults and flaws, that's another matter, but simply the things he believed in and stood for and fought for. And, you know, that's our England of today, is still a product of these debates. No, you're the one who must tell it. You're the biographer. That's your podium. I've no insight. Well, there are two very different questions. All I can say about how he would have reacted to the war against terrorism, he was against terrorism. He was against all form of terrorist activity, and would certainly have devised methods within his own capabilities of dealing with it. We don't know what those methods would have been. When he was confronted by terrorism in Ireland, he acted against it with great severity, while of course holding out this extraordinary olive branch of negotiating with the terrorists if they would lay down their arms, which they did. That may not be the possibility today. I don't think Mr. Zarqawi is in the market for laying down his arms. But that was his approach, that to deal with the utmost severity, including the use of bombing, subject I have to lecture a week today in Washington on, bombing the Irish rebels, bombing the Iraqi rebels in Tel Afar, of all places, which was in the news last week. But saying the door is always open the moment you cease your terrorist activities to sit down and negotiate. And that, of course, is a difficult thing, as we found, as John Major and Tony Blair found with Ireland. It took really a decade and a half, even after the intention to sit down was announced. Why he didn't attend Roosevelt's funeral was that, by accident, many senior members of administration, including the Foreign Secretary and the Home Secretary, were not in the country. Some were in San Francisco at the opening of the United Nations, and others were abroad on other missions. And he felt, his initial reaction was to go. He got his aeroplane and he instructed Halifax to make the arrangements at this end, and the arrangements were made. But he then felt, and I'm sure he was right, that he had to make the tribute in the House of Commons. This was something very, very important in British political life. Here was the president dead, the war had to carry on, his initial instinct to leave couldn't be followed out because so many of his senior ministers were abroad, and Parliament needed to be the place. He was first and foremost a parliamentarian, and Parliament was the place where the tribute had to be made. And it would have been very bizarre if Clement Attlee or Herbert Morrison or Ernest Bevin had made the tribute. And so he made the tribute in the Parliament and then attended the great memorial service. I have a very powerful photograph of him leaving the memorial service at St. Paul's with his daughter Sarah. Funnily enough, I discussed this once. This is a very bizarre question. There was one American who believed that Churchill had deliberately not gone to the funeral. And quite why he would deliberately not go as a sort of anti-Rooseveltian gesture is beyond me to understand. And that American was convinced that Churchill had intended to slight Roosevelt. And when Churchill died, because of that, because he believed Churchill had slighted Roosevelt deliberately, he did not go to Churchill's funeral. And I spoke to him about it, but he was adamant that he was right, and that was President Lyndon Johnson. So it's an important question because it had this bizarre repercussion. But the American president was not at St. Paul's for Churchill's great funeral.
All right, now that I see it,
It's a bit bizarre, but it's...
next.
Okay.